George Whitefield, America's spiritual founding father and the first Prince of Preachers. The two great awakenings in the history of America are as important an event that has ever happened to this land. Two influential moments in the infant years of North America have framed this country at its core. The first Great Awakening was a revival of souls turning back to God of the Bible. There were several leaders who helped bring about the much-needed revival and who helped to bring an end to the moral decay of the British colonies. There were several prominent figures in the First Great Awakening in North America. Leaders such as Samuel Davies, Isaac Watts, Jonathan Dickens, Gilbert Tennent, John Wesley, and known as one of the greatest theologians of all time, Jonathan Edwards, who resided in New England. There was one who stood out among the British colonies, however, one whose fame compared to only George Washington himself. George Whitefield. George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards became two of the most prominent leaders of this great movement in the early colonies. George Whitefield set himself apart from many others. He was a bit unique, and because of this uniqueness, the colonies would see his message and his fame spread throughout the developments and parts of North America, where thousands upon thousands would come in masses to watch him preach from the Holy Word. George Whitefield left a significant mark in the world of his day. In fact, that mark that he made echoes into the world that we still know, not only in our Christian circles, but also in the forming of this great nation. His great passion, his great speaking abilities opened the eyes of many in the culture of his day and influenced many to turn to Christ, and even some who were already Christians to return to their Christian roots that they had left. George Whitefield, though at times can be very complex, particularly on some issues that we'll get into, was a man who cared very much about the souls of men and the glory of God. He is without a doubt, as Thomas S. Kidd puts it, America's spiritual founding father. Let's, however, start at the beginning. George Whitefield, as stated in biographies about him by Thomas Kidd and another by Jessica Parr, tell us of his very modest upbringing. He was born in Gloucester, England. He was born in 1714. And as Jessica Parr points out in her book, he oftentimes mentioned that he was actually born in an inn, the inn his parents owned, and he sometimes draws a comparison to the nativity story. He began at Pembroke College as a natural science major, but then due to circumstances in his life, he converted to Christianity. He met John and Charles Wesley in Oxford at college, and they formed a club at the school that was labeled the Holy Club, which Mark Knoll and Ian Maddock and Andrew Atherstone discuss at length in all their writings. Their friendship would then lead into them forming what we know as today as Methodism, which is a Christian denomination. They derived its name from certain practices that they had in studying the Holy Scriptures, as well as sharing the gospel, again, like Mark Knoll mentions briefly, in a history of Christianity in the United States and Canada. One of those methods that he stated was preaching in the open air. The Wesley brothers and Whitefield had adopted some doctrine that countered the Anglican Church. Therefore, the Anglican Church has not allowed them to teach any longer, so they took their methods outside. And when they looked at the holy text, they used these methods and justified themselves by looking at Peter and Jesus when they typically would teach in the open air. This was essentially the beginning stages that framed George Whitefield and his commitment and ferociousness to communicate the gospel and evangelize to the world. Now, after that brief little introduction, there are several things that we'll highlight as we discover a little bit more of who he was. And we'll cover these things as followed. The Great Awakening and his role, his work across denominational walls, his relationship with the Wesleys, some of his missionary tours and kind of what they look like, his preaching style, his relationship with Jonathan Edwards, his complex stand on slavery, and just a little bit to end with his lasting legacy. Let's start with the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening started between the 1730s and 1740s, which is actually ironic because the Great Awakening had already started to see some progress throughout the colonies, even before the arrival of George Whitefield. In fact, this could have been a good thing, and the reason why Whitefield and his message was so well received. George Whitefield being inspired by the Wesleys both by their courage to go on a missionary journey to Georgia, but also inspired by their failure, because they did have a failure when they went to Georgia on a missionary trip, as Thomas Kidd puts it in his book. Georgia was also an ideal place for missionary trips, as you did not need permission from the Anglican bishops. Whitefield had his desire to do solely itinerant ministry, as opposed to the mainline preachers, what they were doing during that day. He wanted to travel and preach and do tours of essentially missionary work. So in 1738, he ventured out to Georgia on his first trip. Once Whitefield had returned to England, he was raising money in order to return back to the colonies to do some preaching, to do another preaching tour, and to raise money for an orphanage as well. He had returned to North American continent a couple years later, and his ministry was now flourishing due to word getting out about how dramatic and impactful his preaching methods were. Whitefield was also very aware of his public persona. He used the media to build his reputation as well as build the ministry. In the article, Peddler and Divinity, George Whitefield and the Great Awakening, they showed the kind of methods that he used in order to build his ministry. Whitefield started writing down his sermons and publishing them to get word out. He would also take out newspaper ads to promote when he was coming to visit, to build anticipation. This was something that was new at the time. He began to rethink the way in which to reach the lost. Lambert, in the same article, Peddler and Divinity, even discussed how Whitefield would take out ads to give updates of where he was, what his sermons were, and kind of what was next for George Whitefield. He became such a prominent figure that people were highly interested in what he was doing and where he was doing it at. The next thing that I want to discuss is his work across denominational walls. One of the specific areas that helped Whitefield grow in his appeal and in his population was the fact that he was communicating across denominational walls. As already mentioned by Jessica Parr and Thomas S. Kidd, they highlight this fact. George Whitefield communicated the narrative of the Bible and the Gospels, and this allowed him, though he had his own differing theologies from a lot of these denominations, this helped him to appeal to many different denominations and them to accept him in, which in turn, again, helped his appeal and his ability to grow his ministry. But let's also discuss his relationship with the Wesleys. We touched on it briefly already about his relationship and how they met at college. Though he appealed to many throughout different denominations, the one group he did lose connection with was the Wesley brothers. Though they were close at one point, they just couldn't reconcile their differences at one point. I have already briefly mentioned this again about their Holy Club in Oxford, but this had created quite a divide for them. Andrew Atherstone reviews, in his review of the article Men of One Book, a comparison between Wesley and Whitefield, he notes, as well as acknowledging other commentaries on their relationship, that it had ruptured pretty significantly. Atherstone states, if Whitefield the man emerges in Sharp, and he's also quoting other articles and bringing them into his article, if Whitefield the man emerges in Sharp, if unpleasant, Relief, and Schlether's sketch, the next two essays clarify the clergyman's theological and ecclesiastical commitment. Mark K. Olson's contribution carefully charts Whitefield's emergence as a Calvinist in the 5 years after his 1735 conversion experience. He preached a new birth through this period, but what the new birth meant, both theologically and experimentally, changed as his theology evolved. Atherstone, now quoting Olson in the article, the spontaneous character of the revival impressed on Whitefield that conversion was the work of God alone. And over time, this inclined him to a more reformed view of salvation. Whitefield's affirmation of the Calvinist doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, the idea that truly regenerated would never fall out of God's favor, also emerged out of his own religious experience. His Calvinism, however, led him to break with John Wesley and the fracturing of the Methodist movement. Whitefield's ecclesiology has often seemed less defined than his theology, for although he was an Anglican priest, he was also seen as a darling of the dissenters. Moreover, he tended to eschew denominational labels in favor of evangelical ecumenism, preaching Christ crucified to anyone who would listen. So this speaks to the willingness he had to work outside of denominational boundaries, but yet his relationship and his difference with the Wesleys was something that was broken, that was not reconciled until later in his life. Andrew Atherstone also goes on to review in Ian Maddox's work, which compares their views on ministry and their great rupture. In Andrew Atherstone's review, again, of the Men of One Book, a comparison between Wesley and Whitefield, he notes their difference as stated. The style of Wesley's sermons, by comparison, was reserved and scholarly, consciously devoid of drama. Concerning core doctrines, Maddox rightly observes that terminological agreement far from ensures theological agreement, especially on free grace and Christian perfectionism within significant pastoral implications. Whitefield mistook Wesley's evangelical Arminianism for semi-Pelagianism, and Wesley mistook Whitefield's Calvinism for hyper-Calvinism, as it would lead to etonium lentitiousness, I think is how you pronounce it, which basically means reckless behavior and spiritual passivity. So there was a little bit of a miscommunication which led to discord there. Mark Knoll does state in his book, again, a history of Christianity in the United States and Canada, and I quote, "Later, Wesley and Whitefield were reconciled as friends, though not in theological opinion. And Wesley preached a sermon of warm commendation after Whitefield's death. But Whitefield was much more interested in preaching than in theology. Although he affirmed the doctrines of predestination, election, and the definite atonement, all themes of traditional Calvinism, he confessed in a letter to John Wesley early in his career that, quote, "I never read anything Calvin wrote. My doctrines I had from Christ and his apostles. I was taught them of God." So though Whitefield was willing to cross denominational boundaries, and many appreciate that fact, he was hard-pressed until later in his life with his relationship with the Wesleys, and then they once did reconcile. Now to briefly highlight as well his missionary journeys. One thing again that set him apart and the Anglican Church did not like about him, as referred again by Jessica Parr and Thomas S. Kidd, is the idea of his itinerant ministry. Whitefield, as opposed to some other preachers during the time, had mainly other prominent leaders of the Great Awakening, like Jonathan Edwards, for example. Whitefield traveled around and solely did itinerant ministry, going from place to place. This was a form of mission work or circuit preaching, as we would probably know as today. This was not a practice that the Anglican Church liked nor adopted at this time in the immediate. This is one of the primary reasons as well. He was well known all around us because of his frequent traveling. Here is a picture I want to show. This is a picture from Mark Knoll's book and gives us a little map of and details of the tours that Whitefield took during his ministry. He took a total of 7 preaching tours in what we know as now as the United States. His first preaching tour was in 1738 when he made his first trip to Georgia. Then he returned again 2 years later to huge crowds, and his last tour was in 1770 when he died. In the States, again, Mark Knoll points this out in his book, just as Whitefield desired to do, he died in the States preaching the gospel. Now, one of the main things that set George Whitefield apart, and the next thing I'll communicate, is about his preaching style. We discussed his early life very briefly, but one thing that he was involved in during his teenage years was acting. He had training in theater, and he would try to use this in his communication of his sermons, believing this would have a better impact on people who were listening. Well, he was right in believing that, because he became known for this by many. In our modern day, we have labeled a few others as Prince of Preachers, such as Charles Spurgeon, but because of his delivery and his dramatic approach, he truly was the first Prince of Preachers. Whitefield's training in theater played a major role in his presentation. Knoll describes him as having a very structured approach, a very systematic approach in his delivery. Jessica Parr discusses how he abandoned the book of prayers from the Anglican Church, electing to write his own sermons, and oftentimes spontaneous sermons as well, which again is one of the methods the Anglican Church did not like. Being able to do this, he could add in his flair and flare up his presentation and make it a little bit more dramatic. Though he renounced acting, believing it to be a worldly practice, he did use what he had learned. Ian Maddock frequently calls him an actor-preacher in his writings. Whitefield worked hard at appealing to the emotions of a person. Though at times this can look bad in some people's mind, Ian Maddock does go back and acknowledge that Whitefield was not as concerned with entertainment. He was much more concerned with the transformation of souls. In his book, Kidd points out that Whitefield was famous for speaking to thousands upon thousands of people in the open air at one time. Knoll states that Whitefield spoke to nearly 8,000 people nearly every day for a month in New England in the fall of 1740. Jessica Parr states in her book that he spoke to as many as 30,000 at one time in England on one of his tours. Whitefield had an uncanny ability to draw a crowd and then speak in such a way as to where everyone could hear him in the open air. He appealed greatly to the emotions of people by communicating the narratives of the Bible with great drama. Whitefield, in fact, was so impacting that Ben Franklin, though never converted to the message of Christianity, became an admirer of Whitefield. Many times going to see Whitefield preach and then being so moved by the message that he would empty out his pockets and support Whitefield's ministry. Mark Knoll in his book states that Ben Franklin had doubts about the voice capacity and the rumors about Whitefield's voice. There were rumors about this that had traveled across the transatlantic colonies during this time, about the power, the magnitude of his voice. Rumor had spread that he preached to 30,000 plus people in the open air in England. And so when he came to the colonies, Ben Franklin went to see him in Philadelphia, and he put him to the test. Franklin started taking steps away from Whitefield as he spoke, and came and then calculated a distance, the sound, and was convinced after a couple calculations that indeed it was accurate, that his voice could be heard by upwards of 30,000 people in the open air. This story is also confirmed by Christopher Grasso in his article reflecting on George Whitefield, life, context, and legacy. The oddest chapter in the volume is called Whitefield's Voice by Braxton Bourne. And again, this is by Christopher Grasso. This is quotes. Ben Franklin doubted press accounts from London claiming that Whitefield's booming voice had reached crowds as large as 30,000 people or more. So, 1739, as the evangelist preached from the courthouse steps in Philadelphia, Franklin walked backwards until he could no longer hear the words distinctly, and then did a quick back of the envelope calculation to determine that yes, in open air Whitefield really could have been heard by a crowd that large. Bourne, a researcher in applied acoustics with a PhD in music technology, uses modern science to answer Franklin's question. After measuring the decibel levels of trained actors and opera singers and assessing effective sound pressure levels, employing modern density area calculations, computer modeling Whitefield's different speaking environments, employing the speech transmission index to estimate Franklin's ability to hear, and using an acoustic cone tracing algorithm in a CAT acoustic, Bourne concludes that Franklin was right. Jessica Parr points out in an interview regarding her book that sound engineer from NYU, New York University, has conducted experiments as well regarding some of these claims, and they actually can corroborate, in the words of Jessica Parr, that this indeed was possible and that his voice was this powerful. One of the things that helped him communicate so effectively was his simple speech. Mark Knoll states this as well in other regards to him wanting to be understood by even the uneducated. This was one of the practices that him and the Wesleys, it got him and the Wesleys kicked out of it, or got discommunicated from the Anglican Church as well, is because they wanted to reach the unsophisticated people. In order to do that, they had to learn to speak a plain language to appeal to masses. This, along with his dramatic approach and his travel, was all reasons to why he was so well loved and so appreciated during his time. So, let me also talk about Edwards and his relationship with Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. I felt that this was really important because these are the two crucial figures who led the great movement in North America. They are both looked at as two of the most prominent figures in the history of Christianity in North America, and primarily they were contemporaries during this time. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield did have a relationship. They came from the same theological circle, that being of Calvinism. Now, briefly, I'll quote a source here in just a minute, but let me explain the scenario. Whitefield had so much hype and popularity that Edwards wanted to have him at his church to speak in New England. He also knew that they were similar in their personal theology as well. Chamberlain goes on in an article, The Grand Sower of the Seed, Jonathan Edwards' Critique of George Whitefield, to discuss potential differences that Whitefield and Edwards had. Though Edwards in public always spoke highly of Whitefield, many, as Chamberlain explores briefly in that article, speculate that Edwards had a bit of resentment towards Whitefield, being that Whitefield had such an impact in Edwards' church, seemingly, at least to the naked eye. More impact maybe than Jonathan Edwards did. This, though, is all speculation, but Edwards does offer some things that they, even though both Calvinists, differed on. Whitefield did not consider himself a theologian, never wanted to entertain a conversation with Edwards about this, as Ava Chamberlain discusses. In short, Jonathan Edwards questioned Whitefield's methods, particularly in his itinerant ministry. He would teach, present the gospel, and then basically move on to the next city. Edwards wanted to talk about his methods and as a source of follow-up in the salvific process. Whitefield saw that people believed in Christ and they were good. This is pure speculation, but this could have been the reason why the Wesleys had mistaken Whitefield's form of Calvinism as a hyper form of Calvinism as well. Again, just to reiterate, a lot of this is educated speculation, but it is important to note a slight discord between the two biggest names of the First Great Awakening. And then one of the complex issues about George Whitefield is his views on slavery. Now, covering several important things regarding such a significant person who had such an impact can be a daunting task. One of the key areas is his view on slavery. Many critique Whitefield because of his view on slavery, but in short, Parr realized it is much more complex than we would like to label it. Parr admits that he was pro-slavery, though Samuel Smith, in his critique of Parr, agrees that he owned slaves, but disagrees with the direct conclusion and mentions that it is highly more complex than what Parr would like to make it. Parr would set up a point and point out that he had a positive view on slavery was much more because of economic growth and evangelistic outreach. Whitefield, being in Georgia very often, saw that Georgia was a very impoverished colony, and there was in fact not enough British colonial people to work the ground and improve the economy in Georgia, as opposed to South Carolina, which was a very wealthy colony. Parr essentially says that his support of slavery was directly related to economical reasons and reasons for preaching the gospel. He saw having slaves as providing jobs, food, treating them right, giving them housing, and even providing an education. And even slaves later on would even vouch for that Whitefield was a huge influence in their lives and helped educate them. Whitefield was not pro-abuse of slaves, but pro-providing them with a good life and employing them in different terminology. Parr uses examples of private letters that Whitefield would write to slave owners condemning them for their treatment of slaves to prove her point. You can also look at the work of his sermons to see the treatment and his belief that he had of treating others and educating others as well. In conclusion, it's incredibly hard to highlight the many wonderful and complex ideas about Whitefield, who had such a lasting impact. But there are many examples of him educating natives and slaves and helping them better their life and actually employing them, not just being pro-slavery. So his impact felt today. O.C. Edwards, in a review about Thomas S. Kidd's biography on Whitefield as America's spiritual founding father, he rejects that Whitefield is a founding father of America's spiritual roots based solely on his disagreement regarding Whitefield's Calvinist beliefs. This, though, I find by O.C. Edwards is highly irresponsible. George Whitefield had a huge influence and was a huge advocate for treating people the right way and spreading the gospel message. Parr and Samuel agree in this light that he was not intentioned to directly influence for American freedom, because he often argued that he didn't want to get caught up in temporal matters, but that he had a huge impact on the founding of America. Whitefield did have a lasting impact. As being the main prominent figure in the First Great Awakening, he helped inspire a great multitude of people to believe in the Messiah. He indirectly influenced leaders who would develop our government, which finds its roots in Christianity. He inspires pastors and preachers alike to take seriously the gospel message and to advocate for the education of blacks and natives. Whitefield truly is, among the many complexities that surround him, America's spiritual founding father.